Hey, deserving listeners, this is chapter 14, the final chapter in my apology deep dive, in which I finish answering your questions that you emailed in. So let's get to it. Omar commented on Patreon and said, I would like to apologize and ask for your forgiveness, Dr. Kirk Honda, for being a geography pedant on YouTube comments on your first Ella and Johnny reaction video. I like to show off my limited knowledge of geography and history because I derive some self-worth from that. Also, I was in a headspace where I was learning a lot about Malaysia to prepare to visit family, and I thought the comment would get buried, and I didn't think it would attract any attention. I'm sorry if that came off as serious criticism. It wasn't. End of email or end of comment. Yeah, I remember that, I believe. Omar, you were pointing out that I hadn't mentioned Malaysia, I think. I was listing off a bunch of Asian countries, and I was saying, I believe I was commenting on how people will say, well, that person is Asian, as if that describes one's culture. More than half of the world's population could be categorized as quote-unquote Asian, even if you exclude Northwest Asia. If you just include South and East Asia, I think that's probably like 60% of the world population. So you'd be more specific by saying someone's culture is not Asian. Imagine lumping all of Europe and all of North America, all of South America, all of Africa, all of Australia into one culture. Well, that would be less egregious than lumping all of South Asia and all of East Asia together. And I was saying, there's so many countries, one, and two, in each country, there are so many different cultures. So to say someone's Asian is ridiculous. And I was listing a bunch of countries, and I didn't mention Malaysia. I think that's what was happening. And Omar, in the comments section on YouTube, was just like, oh, you missed Malaysia. And I think I've already talked about this at some point, like during a comments video, I might have addressed that. But no, Omar, I did not take that as criticism. I am a bit of a geography pedant myself, and I appreciate that sort of thing. But thanks for apologizing. That's very nice of you, and I like taking care of others, and I like it when people take care of me. All right. Annual anonymous patron wrote in, and she says, my father and I have never met in person, and we have only spoken 3 times on the phone, which started this year. I told him that, although I didn't show it, I was extremely angry and hurt and couldn't go forward with our relationship until he apologized. I was supposed to call him today, but I didn't, possibly as a passive aggression. I think I feel stuck because I've hated him my whole life for choosing to be absent, and feeling any other way is scary to me. My therapist thinks I should give him a chance, which also annoys me a little. Like, how would he even know? I think Bob has mentioned self-righteousness as being a safer place than opening oneself up. I loved the apology deep dive, so much so that I was inspired to reach out to my father after 5 months of ignoring him. End of email. Well, anonymous annual patron, I'm glad that you're able to take the time to think about this. Of course, you're fine either way. You can do whatever you want to. You can shut him out of your life and remain safe and upset and draw a boundary there. That's healthy. Obviously, you can do what you want. And you could also open yourself up, take that risk, and try to build a relationship with him, maybe even some corrective experiences on your terms. I don't know. That's also healthy. So you're choosing now to seek an apology from him. And I really, really hope that you get that in all of its full glory. I'm imagining that to have the apology be adequate to the situation, to you, that he might literally apologize to you once a week or once a month for the rest of his life with you, because that is a major transgression. I mean, it's one of the top transgressions one could commit on a person. So I hope that you get that. And I'm guessing that if he has a heart, which I'm guessing he does, he cares, that there's access to that. People want to have good relationships, particularly with their children, even if they are estranged. And if there's a way to attain that, and there's a prescription to get that, and he knows how to do that, then maybe I'm guessing that, people usually will take you up on that opportunity. All right, this next email is from good old annual patron Show. They say, I want to be clear that you didn't necessarily do anything wrong. However, it did have a really big impact on me. I have PTSD from a fatal car accident, and a while back I came upon the anniversary of the car accident where my friend died. Around that time, I put on a random old episode of the podcast when I couldn't sleep, hoping it would be something that would be calming for me. But it was an episode with Berto, and without any warning, suddenly he was talking in detail about a pretty gruesome car accident that he went through. It was highly triggering for me. I felt really angry and kind of betrayed, actually. I didn't listen to the podcast for a while after that because it suddenly felt unsafe to me. Eventually, of course, I began listening again, although it's certainly not anyone else's responsibility to tiptoe around my triggers. End of email. Yeah, well, Show, I absolutely can imagine how horrible that would feel. You're going to bed, you're hoping to relax, you're listening to a podcast that often is relaxing and soothing, and you hear this story that is difficult for a lot of people just on its face, but if you have PTSD around it and it massively triggers you, then yeah, that's rough, and I'm really, really sorry you went through that. And it's my fault because I should provide more trigger warnings. It's something that over my 14 plus years as a podcaster, I have lagged behind, I think, in my ability to predict or remember to say such things. I think there are things that I've always been fairly good at regarding podcasting, and there are things that I'm probably average at, and there are things that I'm below average. And I think when it comes to trigger warnings, I've been below average for a clinician who podcasts. And I'm trying to work on it, and it doesn't take much, right, to just say something like, oh, because I'm sure that I'd heard that story before. I don't think it was the first time I'd ever heard that story. So I could have predicted where Berto was going with that story and said, oh, by the way, trigger warning, he's about to talk about a pretty gruesome car accident. And of course, I understand that a lot of people have PTSD when it comes to car accidents or loss of life or the threat of a loss of life. So it's not mysterious that someone, you and possibly others, had a bad experience because of a lack of that trigger, warning. So I am sorry, and that's my fault. It's not really Berto's responsibility. He's not a clinician, so he doesn't really know to say those things, and that is my responsibility. And yeah, I'm sorry you went through that. You're clear that you're not blaming me. In the very first sentence, you say you want to be clear that I didn't necessarily do anything wrong. But I think it is good for me to know. This is another reminder for me to be careful about those kinds of things and to take care of the listeners. So it's not hard to do. It's not putting me out that much to think about those sort of things. And car accident PTSD is pretty common. Other kinds of things, there are the obvious ones, but aside from the obvious trigger warnings, I guess really anything that I would predict people would have PTSD about, right? And I think you're modeling for the other deserving listeners out there, Show, that they could advocate for themselves in a similar way. This email, as you always do, is very well written. You're a very good writer. I have told you that a number of times in person. Very descriptive, concise, a writer, convincing writer. And so, I feel it, and when I feel it in my bones, it'll stick with me longer that way. And so for others, they can follow in your footsteps and email me, and of course, to being kind to me, as long as it warrants that, but also saying that, oh, by the way, I have PTSD about this, and when this topic comes up on the podcast, it triggers me, so, no big deal, but if you could just drop in a little trigger warning, then I'll know to fast forward. Yeah, I would love to know that. It would mortify me and give me great pain to think that people are being triggered by the podcast. We talk about some intense things, right? So it's not hard, like I said, for me to take care of people in that way, and I do apologize to you for that show, absolutely. All right, this next email is from Annual Anonymous Upper Tier Patron. She says, I thought the Apology Deep Dive series would be a wash for me, but I'm so pleased I was wrong. I was listening to Chapter 13 of the series at work, and I started to cry during your apology that you gave to the listeners who had been hurt. So just chiming in here, I think what she's referring to is I think I was talking about how in therapy I will sometimes apologize to clients. And then I was like, well, maybe I should just do it to you right now, the listeners. I will apologize on behalf of someone else who has hurt you deeply. And so I did that. And I was curious as to how that would be received. I thought, I don't know. I think I figured that people would be like, that's interesting. But I did have a question as to whether or not it would affect people emotionally, or it would affect you emotionally. So going on with this email here, it was so genuine and soothing to me. I felt recognized and advocated for when you apologized. I don't think I'll be able to articulate it fully how I felt. Thank you for saying everything you said and how much weight the acknowledgement carried. I hope other listeners were able to get a bit of what I felt. So just chiming in here. Yeah, well, that's why I do it in therapy. I don't do it very often. I've also done it to students as well. As I've been saying throughout this series, I think that for a lot of us, not all of us, some of the listeners have pointed out that they're not like this, but I think for a lot of us, we are walking around with some major unclosed or unaddressed transgressions upon us. A lot of major ones, a lot of medium ones, and maybe thousands of small ones, right? But there's some big ones, right? Like the earlier emailer talked about how her father hadn't been in her life, her entire life. That's just a massive transgression. Or you have a parent who's narcissistic, or you have a sibling who bullied you, or you have a government and a society and a community that oppressed you. You were transgressed upon in a major, major way. And the apology that you deserve wouldn't erase that, but it would be a start, right? It would be the beginning of an acknowledgement, of a healing process for all involved. And when I role play an apology, a deep apology, I think just below the surface for a lot of people, clients, students, you listening, just below the surface is are those unaddressed transgressions, and they get touched on, and you feel it, right? And we can learn from that. Not only, as I've been saying, that it can focus us on our own needs to try to get those apologies somehow, either from the individual or vicarious through other means in therapy or something. But also, in all likelihood, we have transgressed on others, and they are walking around with those hurts just below their surface, and they're listening to a podcast and they're beginning to cry as someone's apologizing vicariously on your behalf, right? So we've all been transgressed upon, and we have all transgressed. And if we can move forward into the future, not only interpersonally in relationships like marriages and friendships and work relationships, but also as a nation, as a world, as cultures interacting. Men have a lot to apologize to women about. White people have a lot to apologize to non-white people about. Americans have a lot to apologize to non-Americans. The Republicans have a lot to apologize to the oppressed people of this country. I'm sure Democrats have a lot to apologize for as well. Well, on the topic. Every parent has a lot to apologize for. Every child has a lot to apologize for. Every sibling, every coworker, every friend, every partner, every former partner. I just think it's so powerful. Think about for yourself what you would like an apology for. I mean, if you want, right? Just brainstorm, just free associate, and write down all the things from all the people and the groups of people that you would like an apology for. Maybe even you want an apology from God or something, right? Like someone died in your family and you're just like, God owes me an apology for that shit. So just make a list and imagine how long the list might be, right? Maybe even rate them on a scale from 1 to 10 or something of intensity. And then imagine, again, what you probably should apologize for, even if there's no indication, right? Because you won't necessarily get an indication from someone. You might have to imagine or take a guess and then reach out to that person and apologize regardless. All right, let's take a break, and when we get back, we'll answer more emails. All right, I'm back from the break. So the break went longer than I thought it was going to go. I thought I was just going to have dinner and then come back to the microphone. But I don't know. I just feel like sharing what happened. It's not that interesting, but it's kind of interesting to me. So Stacy's out with a friend having dinner tonight, so I'm just in the office here with the dogs and recording with y'all. And so I decided to order some food delivered so I wouldn't be taken away from the microphone for any more time than I wanted to be. I ordered from Royal Grinders. Shout out to Royal Grinders in Fremont. It's a sandwich place. And yeah, if you're ever in Fremont, go to Royal Grinders or, Grubhub delivery, that kind of thing. Anyway, point is I got my sandwich and I sat down to watch something on TV. And so I started watching, I just was randomly flipping through things and found myself on Disney Plus. And then I was looking at Pixar, and then I saw Inside Out, and I was like, it's been a while since I've watched that movie. I love that movie. If you've ever listened to my top 10 reviews of, all movies I've ever seen in my life, Inside Out's in the top 10, if not the top 5, if not the top 3. I'm not sure where it is in there, but it's up there. So I'm rewatching it, and immediately I just start to cry. I know I tend to cry a lot in movies anyway, but with this movie, I knew I'd be crying at the very end, at the very least, because top 5 crying moments, I suppose, in movies, Inside Out at the very end definitely is up there. So I was ready for that, but I started crying like right away because I don't know, I don't know if I've ever seen the movie again. I saw it and it was amazing, and I've watched a lot of clips, and we did a whole episode about it, me and Berto, but I don't know if I've ever just sat down and watched the whole thing over again. And there's so many things that are foreshadowing the eventual climax of the movie later on. There's all these, if you know the story, and it works on so many levels, this movie Inside Out. It's not only is it entertaining, it's interesting. It's basically kind of like a road trip movie between joy and sadness, and they've got to get back home, right? And these two characters don't really like each other. They have conflict, and so they've got to, there's been a lot of road trip movies over the years, and it's an adventure, and it also it raises all these interesting concepts. It depicts what dreams might look like in our subconscious and what the unconscious might look like in the unconscious, and what abstract thought is and what emotions are and how memory works and how thoughts work and how schemas work and how core memories work and all that kind of stuff. It's just an interesting model of understanding how we operate as humans psychologically and personality-wise. And it's tense. I forgot how it resolved, and it moves real fast, too. A lot of things happen, and I think if you cut out the credits, it's probably like an hour and 15-minute movie. Anyway, so I was just going to watch like 20 minutes of it while I'm having my grinder, and I ended up watching the whole thing, and I saw that there's probably 12, 15 moments where I was crying on a level that I only do every now and then. I don't know if there's a lot of pent up emotion for me, but the message that's really driven home is something that I frequently am yammering about and only kind of recently figured out in the last 5 years or so, that in our culture, and of course the movie is all about this, that we value joy and happiness and stoicism, and we very much dislike sadness and vulnerability. If anything, we want to be angry and disgusted. We don't want to be afraid because that's weak, and we definitely don't want to be sad because that's really weak, and that's very un-American to be sad or to be upset about something, to dwell on the past, this kind of thing. And the way that this movie depicts it is just, it's genius. I mean, there's so many little things about the way emotions are dealt with and the way the emotions deal with each other, and how as we grow older, we become more abstract in our thinking and our understanding of things, and thus that applies to emotions as well. There's tons of theory around this and research, and I'm guessing that the writers had access to that, or they just came up with it on their own. Either way, it's brilliant stuff. And the ability to mix emotions, how things aren't black and white, but they kind of are when we're younger. When we're younger, we tend to see things as black and white. We have a hard time integrating things and differentiating in the moment, whereas this movie kind of depicts that developmental step that the character makes. She, at the beginning of the movie, things are distinct. The memories are distinct. They're either happy or they're sad or they're scary. But at the end of the movie, she is mixing the emotions and the vibe of all memories. No memory is just one thing. There's aspects to a lot of memories. For example, you might have joy about something. You had a joyous experience, but there's a sadness to it because the fact that you felt joy in the moment recognizes that there are some times where you experience sorrow. And of course, this is more familiar to non-Americans and cultures that aren't like American culture, that tends to understand the duality, yin yang, this kind of stuff. Anyway, so I'm watching the movie and I'm thinking I should get back to recording the episode, but and then there was just so much sobbing. And also, as I'm sobbing, I'm thinking personally about my own, just ignored sobbingness. There's a lot to be sad about in the world. And also, so here's the point, is that I've been yammering about this for a bit now, that the reason why we cry is because we are signaling to other people that we need support and help and care and attunement. And if you ever look online and you search for, why do we have tears? The top number of answers that you'll get from people are, well, it's because you have a neurotransmitter that builds up when you're under stress. And when you cry, the neurotransmitter is released through the tears. And it's like, okay, maybe that's a reason. But to me, that ignores all of the science around evolution and around emotion and around sociology and psychology, which has billions of arrows of evidence pointing towards the fact that we cry because we are trying to signal to other humans that we need help, that we need support. Sadness, emotion, upwelling within us, and under certain circumstances of sadness, we will actually produce tears and sob and wail. As I'm crying, I was kind of marveling at how these involuntary sobbing noises, like, yeah, like because, it's one thing to be crying. It's another thing to have your lungs to kind of convulse, right? Because it's another signal to people around us. There's a lot of signaling when we cry, right? Particularly younger, but really at any age. We have the tears coming out. We have the snot coming out. We have our lungs are convulsing. And then I think there's an involuntary engagement of our larynx, because it's one thing to have your breathing go, but it's another thing to go, and sometimes it feels good to lean into that and to kind of purposely engage one's voice box to wail, but it was involuntary. I'm just sitting in here, Stacy's out with her friends, and the dogs, although the dogs care, they do care, because they have a similar vocalization when they're upset. I don't know if they evolved that as being domesticated, but anyway, so I am sobbing and I'm feeling better as I'm doing it, right? At the same time that my body is reaching out for connection and attunement, I have another part of me that is attuning myself to me. That's the magic of being a human. And with abstract thought, we can be two people at one time. I can be both the crier and the attuned parent who is taking care of me, right? Allowing myself to cry, telling myself it's okay to cry, telling myself it's okay to be sad, telling myself I'll be okay, but don't stop crying because that's important. And I feel liberated right now. And I hope that y'all have that as well. And if you need something to get the waterworks going, Inside Out. And I looked online and found out, because at the end of the movie, they end with this kind of a jokey cliffhanger that puberty is about to occur with Riley, the kid. And Joy is saying, everything's great now. We're established in San Francisco, and Mom and Dad are happy, and I'm doing well in hockey. Everything. Riley's doing great. What could possibly go wrong? And then there's this alarm beacon on the control board that says puberty on it, and it looks like a danger signal that will go off when Riley goes through puberty. So I'm thinking, well, they should make an Inside Out too. Imagine what you could do. And you could probably start to elaborate on the model. You could incorporate trauma, for example. It seems kind of cliche at this point, or grief. I feel like it's almost cliche to involve a storyline involving trauma or grief. But I feel like this movie, the writers, would be able to address that in such a deep, rich, interesting way and evidence-based way, a way that they incorporate research. There was one thing that I found a little goofy psychologically model-wise, was they seem to have a very Freudian idea of the unconscious, which is not a lot of the things that were involved in the model of Inside Out, and maybe I'll do a whole series of episodes about, because there's so many things about that movie that are so complex and involve things that involve our lives all the time. And of course, we know about these things. We've been researching them and philosophizing about them and creating emotional models about them. But to have it depicted in this really rich, interesting, entertaining way is special. There's really nothing like Inside Out in that way. So it's not only a wonderful movie that I find just with that, even if it wasn't psychologically oriented, I find it to be just an amazingly written, very compelling story. And also the satisfaction that, skip forward a couple minutes if you don't want to hear the ending, but the climax of the movie, and I've said this before in the podcast, is a child crying in her parents' arms. That's the climax of the movie. It's not, Captain America destroying the universe or bringing it back or whatever. It's not Officer McClane taking down the terrorists at the Nakatomi Plaza. It is a little girl who is having a rough time because they moved across the country and she misses all of her people, that instead of running away, she feels sad and she cries. She goes to her parents and she just says, I'm sad. I miss Minnesota. And the parents hold her. And that's the climax. And it's gripping story. I mean, it is, you're on the edge of your seat, and you're sobbing and you're laughing and you're happy. And then the kid starts to smile in the midst of, it's the first dual memory that she has, that she's sad that she misses Minnesota, but she's happy that she can cry and that her, I'm going to cry again, that her parents are there for her, her parents are also sad and it just gets me. Yeah. And then it ends with this really funny series of entering a bunch of people's heads, including a dog's head and a cat's head. And there is one thing. So with the unconscious, there were two things that kind of threw me. And then the bing bong bit, it still gets me, Anyway, but the unconscious, they were, and it's for laughs. It's just a cartoon, but there's so much rigor involved in this model that it kind of disappointed me that they had in the unconscious, that their model is that's where all the scary things go, right? That's where your deepest, darkest fears go. And that's kind of a Freudian idea, which I won't go into that much, but I was kind of like, it's kind of like, anyway, point is there's that. And then the other thing that I remember kind of bugging me even when it came out 5 or 6, 7 years ago or something, whenever it came out, was when we enter the mom's head, she is saying, so the three of them are sitting around a table having dinner, and the kid, Riley, she's having a hard time, and she's giving a little attitude, and she's being a little eye-rolly. And the mom is trying to engage with her while Riley is giving her attitude. And the mom inside, because we go inside the mom's head, and so the emotions go inside the mom's head, are like, okay, we're having some trouble. Let's bring the dad in and let's signal to him. Okay, so then they press the control board, and then the mom looks to the dad and tries to get his attention. The dad is daydreaming about sports. And then he looks up, and then we enter his head, and we see his emotions behind the control board, and they're like, oh no, she's looking at us. We were daydreaming about something. And then he gets upset, and then, I don't know, the whole thing just played as a very stereotyped version of what genders are supposed to be like. Of course the mom is attentive to the child, and of course the dad is just thinking about sports. And now, could that happen? Sure. But I don't know. It just feels like it's a little played out. It's a little 1970s. It's a little regressive. It's a little sexist to everyone involved. It's a good scene. I think it plays well, but I don't know. It just kind of, I still enjoy the scene, but there's a part of me that's like, couldn't you mix this up a little bit more? So in summary, Break, Wife Out with a Friend, Royal Grinders, Inside Out 2, coming out in 2024, presumably. Lots of crying, connection, vulnerability. Let's read some more emails. All right, this next email is from Upper Tier Anonymous Patron. She writes, I recently had my first anger outburst towards my therapist after 4 years of seeing her. I 100% projected my father onto her. I was completely distorted about her. I have borderline personality disorder traits and disorganized attachment, which resulted in accusing her of many untrue things. My attitude was very hostile, accusatory, and I was as cold as I can be. At the next meeting, I apologized to her for some specific accusations I had made. She said that this was normal in the course of therapy and for this stage of our relationship. We also discussed exactly what I had projected onto her and why. I think she has forgiven me for my false accusations, but I'm still figuring out how to apologize for my hostile approach and generally unpleasant attitude. I just asked her recently, didn't I overreact? Was it too much? but I couldn't apologize directly. She keeps saying that it's all normal, but I feel very bad. End of email. Yeah, well, anonymous upper tier patron, it sounds like you have the perfect therapist who is seeing things, at least from your description, extremely accurately and in a very healthy, helpful way to you. So there's that. And you're not asking me a question, but it sounds like you're at a crossroads or you're in a conundrum where you want to apologize but you feel like she's forgiven you and you just feel uneasy about it. So this points to a huge function in apology, which is, in fact, I should add this to my list. Okay, so I've opened my notes, my deep dive notes on apology, and I keep adding to this section on apology system. And because often when we think about apologies, we just think about the apology, right? And that can be very complicated, obviously, since I yammered about it for so long. But apologies sit at the center of dozens of other very, very important things to consider, one of which is what I think you're getting at, anonymous upper tier patron, which is that you feel like maybe you've already apologized. You feel like maybe forgiveness has already happened, but you're not sure if your therapist is okay with you. You're worried, I think, from what you're saying, that your therapist is still hurt and maybe upset, and that would be anxiety-provoking for anyone, but particularly for you because of your relational traumas and your disorganized attachment. You will ruminate on the worry and the fear and the possibility that she has been pushed away from you a bit. And you don't want that to happen because you want a secure attachment to have earned security experiences, corrective experiences. So what I wrote in my notes right now is that apologies allow the transgressor to check in and ask, are we good now? The apology provides an opportunity to talk directly about the transgression and the hurt feelings and to open the conversation so reconciliation can be furthered. And I kind of like what I wrote there at the end, in particular, that reconciliation, again, in the literature and in life, we tend to think of apologies and forgiveness and reconciliation as something that happens all at once. But for a lot of us, when there are, important transgressions and important hurts, reconciliation, forgiveness, it takes a long time. And I've already talked about forgiveness, and maybe and obviously these things are linked. But I think particularly with you, I think it's reconciliation, right? It's like, are you good with me? Are you harboring any kind of, even though you've forgiven me, it seems like you keep telling me that everything's okay, but I need to feel as though there are no barriers between your care of me because I deeply depend on this corrective experience. And if there is anything that is causing you, my therapist, to be hurt or standoffish to me, I want to correct for that. And another part of it, anonymous up tier patron, for you, given your relational traumas, is there's a possibility that there's a part of you that believes you've screwed it up and you can't fix it. There's nothing you can do to fix it, right? Because of the defective schema potentially that you possess. And so there's this worry of, well, if I ask directly, I might get the answer I'm most terrified, which is that there is no chance of reconciliation because I'm a horrible person and I finally revealed that. I don't know. But so, as Bob always says, talk with your therapist directly about this. And also, if you wanted to, and along these lines, is just apologize again. Just say, hey, I just want to apologize. And if you approach it with your therapist like, this is important to me, because there's a possibility that your therapist doesn't want you to worry about her feelings towards you. There's a possibility your therapist is like, no, we're good. Everything's fine. The things that you said, the therapist said are perfect, right? Your therapist is saying, it's normal in the course of therapy, normal for this stage of the relationship. I mean, just saying all the things that I would say. So, but there's a possibility that your therapist doesn't know that doesn't know the full extent of what's going on in your mind and the full extent of your suffering. Your therapist could think, well, I'm going to reassure her that everything's fine and that I don't take it personally. And this is, I've been around the block a few times and And yeah, it was a little rough, but I feel this is a strong relationship. I don't feel unsafe around this client or anything like that. But there's a possibility that your therapist doesn't really know that this is a perfect opportunity for even deeper corrective experiences, to be reassured that even though you did a pretty horrific thing to your therapist, I mean, it's not horrific like you killed her dog or something, but it sounds like you said some pretty gnarly things. Even though you did that, your therapist still loves you, still cares about you. And if you could really be reassured about that, then how wonderfully corrective that would be, and you deserve that. So, bring it up. All right, let's take another break. We get back, more emails. Okay, we're back from the break. This next email is from upper tier anonymous patron. She writes, I feel really ashamed and really, really dumb. I was one of those people who asked you if there might be an indication as to when you might answer a question that I submitted on the podcast. And I wanted to say that I am sorry. So just chiming in here. Yeah. So I think I got another email. Did I already talk about this? Anyway, point is that a while back, and this has been happening for a number of years, that, I get a lot of emails, and I really love those emails for a lot of reasons. Just being in contact with you, knowing you better, hearing from you, learning from you, and also providing content for this podcast, ideas of what to do. I would say 80% of what I come up with in terms of topics for this podcast are suggestions from y'all. Because, there's so many things to talk about, but I don't want to talk about I don't want to talk about things that no one wants to listen to, aside from the occasional Star Wars or Dungeons & Dragons episode, which I want to do. But I depend on that. And you also will ask questions that I will pose to myself or the co-hosts, and that provides us things to talk about. I depend on you in a big way. And so I and part of that are those emails. So I like that. And every once in a while, someone would ask over email or DM me or something. They'd be like, oh, and by the way, when you answer my question, tell me when you post that answer and what episode, so I can listen to that segment of the episode. And I would say that 9 out of 10 times, the person who is asking me that question doesn't listen to the podcast very often. They might have even only heard 1 or 2 episodes, and they write in a question, and they think of it as like a Dear Abby or something. But for people who listen to the podcast more often, they understand that I make, I think, something like 25 episodes a week now, when you include all the shorts and the videos and everything. And most of the people who are the ongoing fans and listeners would never ask me that question, I don't think, because they would know that would be very hard for me. Because I've literally said sometimes, I think this email's from about a year and a half ago. But so most of the time when someone would ask me, it felt like it was coming from someone that didn't really know the podcast, and or someone that just was pretty arrogant, someone that thought the world revolved around them. And I just and it would come across, the tone that they would have, the way that they would be asking me, could you please tell me when you answer this question? The tone, the vibe was very much like I was their trained monkey that would be doing their bidding, as if the world revolved around them. So there's that. But anonymous upper tier patron, I'm guessing that when you asked that question, it did not come across that way. But it would still have a similar effect on me because of all the other more arrogant and narcissistic requests I would get. So one time on the podcast, in a pretty unfiltered way, I would say, I expressed my anger and hurt around that and annoyance with it, and would tell, I was kind of just venting and sharing, but I think a part of me was also trying to tell people, if you were thinking about asking me such a thing, understand that that's not really possible given my schedule. Now, might we be able to do it someday? I don't know, maybe, but not now. Now, back in the day I could, because I would only get 1 email a month. I could be, I will answer this next week, that kind of, anyway. So, yeah. And when I was complaining about it on the podcast, I don't think I came across as very filtered, as very careful, as very considerate of maybe some of y'all who might have asked for that without being like those narcissistic, arrogant people. Anyway, so I think this is about that. All right, going on with your email. Listening to your she says, I want to say I'm sorry for doing that. And you also say you feel really ashamed and really, really dumb. And that's my fault. I made you feel ashamed, and I made you feel really, really dumb, which is totally unfair. It's fine if you asked me in a non-arrogant, non-narcissistic way. You just like, hey, I really want to know what you think about this question, so please let me know, because I'll make sure I listen to that episode right away. Or, that's fine. That's actually really great. That means you care about my opinion, I guess. So going on with your email. Listening to your podcast has really saved my effing life. There is no amount of words to express how thankful I am for your existence and for your dedication to this podcast, and also your dedication to me. The amount of effort and love and attention you put into your work, how thorough and thoughtful, is immense. So just chiming in here. Thanks a lot. It's nice that's how you see it. I kind of feel, I wouldn't put it in those words, but this podcast is very important to me, and I put in a lot of work. In fact, in a very practical, real sense, tangible sense, I put in all of my work. I work 68 hours a week on average, including vacation time, which isn't very often. And I'm not teaching right now, so I'm not at the university. I don't spend much time doing anything for the university, and my private practice has been getting smaller and smaller over the past couple of years just because I haven't taken any new clients. And so my private practice is very, very small. So I do spend a lot of time. And even when I'm not working, I'll be thinking about the podcast, or, my life is, to a large extent kind of revolves around you. And so that's how I feel about it. And it's nice that you appreciate that, because that's what I'm trying to do, it so that you will appreciate it. That's the meaning of my life. All right, going on with your email. You mentioned that you don't expect that your listeners listen to every piece of content that you publish. And of course, I have a lot of catching up to do, but I really do listen to the majority of it while hiking, ski touring, driving, doing chores, working night shifts. And I enjoy and am grateful for it all. The deep dives, the patron emails, the trial, 90-day, all of it. So just chiming in here. Yeah, so I was saying, because not for you, but for some others, they would narcissistically ask me in a very pushy, arrogant way to tell them when I would answer the question. And it really did come across that they were not regular listeners, that they maybe listen to a couple episodes and might listen to one more in their lifetime, And this happens a lot to me, actually. Someone will, Google something or search for some term on YouTube, and they'll come across an episode and they'll be like, I'll give this a try. And in all likelihood, they turn it off after a minute because they realize that I'm yammering for an hour and a half about something. But for those people who manage to get through it, they are sometimes, a percentage of them will feel like, whoa, that was helpful, or that was interesting, or that piques my interest. I have more questions now. And they will email me right away. There will be people that will hear one episode, or even just 5 minutes of an episode, or watch one of my 90-day episodes, and I'll video reaction videos, and I will mention some concept in brief, even though I might yammer about it for 3 minutes. But these kinds of topics takes hours and hours of lecturing. And it'll prompt. I might be that one person that they've come across on the internet that finally is explaining something in a way that they understand. Not that I am special, but I just happen to be on the internet. There are a lot of people like me, a lot of therapists, a lot of professors that are, know more than I do about various different topics, can explain topics better than I can. So I'm not saying that I'm special in that way. We just have a huge problem in our society in which we have this massive divide between experts and the public. Just go on YouTube, and there are more and more experts on YouTube, but there are way more pseudoscience advocates and pushers and bullshit artists on YouTube than there are true evidence-based experts. Anyway, so they might come across my video and be, and they'll email me, and sometimes people will, because they're not regular listeners, they don't really know my situation, and they'll ask questions. They'll be like, hey, I want to hire you as a therapist. And of course, for y'all who are listening right now, you probably are more ongoing listeners, and you know that that's just never going to happen, especially if you live in a different state. But I haven't, taken a new client in a long time. But, if you're new and you're like, whoa, that guy gets me, I should hire him as my therapist, it stands to reason they'd reach out. I'm just saying that because I get a lot of questions. And in the beginning, it was easy for me to answer all of them, but as time has gone on, it's not. And so I guess that's why I'm saying it. I'm losing my train. That was another part of Inside Out, the train of thought. Watching it the second time, I feel like I got so much more of the references, like the abstract thought. The first time let me go on this jag. The characters walk through an abstract thought converter, if you will, as a shortcut, and they accidentally get locked in, and the operators turn it on while they're in there. And this abstract converter converts things into abstract thought, and there are different phases. And I'm guessing they're working on some psychological model of abstraction in our minds. And it's like, we are now becoming, what's the word? There are different terms that Sadness was listing off. We are becoming two-dimensional now, And when I saw the movie the first time, I thought it was just kind of a funny little obstacle that they had to get through. But I think upon watching it the second time, I don't know if I'm just reading into it, I think what this was that there was a risk that joy and sadness would become abstractions because of the pain that Riley was going through, that they would no longer, so the one way is that they'd become abstractions and unavailable to her as visceral, pure ideas, felt ideas, experience, they're more intellectual abstractions. But I think another thing that they might have been getting at was that as Riley is getting older and experiencing more of the nuances of life, that things can become more abstractions of themselves and thus more integrated. The fact that joy and sadness are more integrated later on in the story might be a product of the mind being able to abstract things more in a robust way, a more better way. And by abstracting sadness and happiness, as we age, we gain a stronger ability to abstract, concepts and our emotions and our self and our existence in the universe, that we can intellectualize them, differentiate from them, but also combine them in ways and experience and understand them as combined, right? That when you're 5, it might be hard for you to combine joy and sadness, but by the time you're 12, you begin that ability, and in order to do that, abstracting these ideas is a part of that. I don't know. I'm just speaking off the top of my head. Anyway, where was I? Let's get back. You say, I have even started to remember hikes, not based on the scenery, but based on what you were talking about while I was listening to the podcast. Moments where I've stopped to laugh out loud or hyperventilate because I'm crying too hard to move. Just chiming in here. Yeah, I had the same thing. There's this one episode of This American Life that I listened to back before podcasting when it was on the radio, and I remember I discovered it on NPR, and I had one of those what they call driveway moments where you're driving home and you're listening to a podcast or radio, and you arrive home or you arrive at your destination, but you don't want to get out of your car. This is back in the day before there were earbuds and that kind of stuff. I mean, I guess you had headphones, but the point is that people would stay in their car. And I had one of those moments while, I was coming home from work, and I'm sitting in my car in the driveway because I wanted to hear the rest of this American Life episode. And I remember it was about memory, actually. And so you've had those moments with me. Like, there are moments of life that I was there with you. You remember the moment when I talked about this and it affected you in this way, and it's associated with this time and place and the scenery and the weather and where you were. And I've done a lot of walking in Seattle, and there are certain street corners downtown that remind me of certain podcasts, even my own podcast. There's all these, again, getting back to Inside Out, there's a whole memory bit going on with email. I see how me asking that question for you to tell me when you were going to answer my question on the podcast is me asking even more of you than you already give me. I see the entitlement there. I see that, and I am really, really sorry. Again, just chiming in here. I don't know if you came across as entitled. I'm guessing you didn't, given your tone of this email. I'm not just saying that. Like, I should have been more abstract and more nuanced and more integrated in my yammering and complaining about people asking me to do that. I should have said that 9 times out of 10, it's from, I think, a narcissistic person or someone that doesn't really understand the landscape of the podcast and thinks that, because there are a lot of podcasts out there that are operating on far fewer emails and probably do have the ability, like I did, for the first 8 years of the podcast, I did have the ability to tell people, oh, by the way, I'm going to answer your email, tomorrow or whatever. So I think there's a section of people like that. But if you're an ongoing listener, and which you are, and you ask me that question, I'm just going to take a guess and say that it didn't come across as narcissistic and entitled. But I made you feel like you were entitled, which is my fault. So please don't go there, But you're apologizing, and so I forgive you. I do. For whatever. So I'm guessing if there was a transgression, I'm guessing what it was that you didn't take into consideration, and this isn't horrible because why would you know this, but you didn't take into consideration the possibility that it might come across as entitled and pushy and arrogant, even though you weren't really coming across that way. It's sort of like when, as an Asian person, I meet a white person who doesn't live on the West Coast and will ask me like where I'm from. So that person isn't purposely trying to alienate me and hurt my feelings, but they're not, because of their ignorance, taking into consideration the possibility that I, as a non-white person, have been asked that question, particularly in my younger years, thousands or hundreds of times. And the implication is I am not from the United States. I'm not from this town, which isn't horrific as a transgression, but bothersome. And there's so much more that cascades off from that, right? It's not just that I'm a foreigner, but I don't belong here, that I don't deserve the same respect. I'm not as American as others. I don't deserve to vote. I need to go back home, so to speak, right? If I don't like it here. If I'm complaining about the United States, like brown people go home, you'll see that from white people. So someone asking me that, if I'm in Spokane, Washington, or I don't know if they'd ask me in Spokane, but if I'm in Missoula or rural town, Montana, and someone asks me, where are you from? They're not being entitled or mean or racist, but they're not considering the fact that that might feel racist to me, right? Now, that's not what you did. That's not a good analogy because it's much worse. But what you did was, so that would be the transgression that you did. So that, on a much smaller scale than where are you from, you innocently asked me a question that I get often enough that it bothers me. It hurts my feelings. It makes me feel disrespected. It makes me feel like people think of me as their trained monkey. And I guess another part of it is I already allow myself to be kind of a trained monkey, which I'm okay with. I am in service to the world, and I'm in service to you, particularly you patrons, right? I I want to be that. I don't mind being in service. I don't mind being subservient, or I don't mind being on people's beck and call, right? I want to be that, and that's part of the meaning of my life. I get meaning and purpose in my life when I'm helpful, and in order for me to get my needs met, to be helpful, you have to let me be helpful, and you have to consider me helpful. You don't have to, but when you do, So a part of this hurt feeling when someone arrogantly or ignorantly asks me that question, if I'll tell them when I answer the question on the podcast, is kind of like, well, I'm already in service. Yeah, I'm already giving, and I want to give. I'm doing it because I want to. And for people to ask even more, right, as if they're the only person that I'm giving to, or something like that, it feels like just a bridge too far or something, maybe, but that, I don't know, that doesn't really feel quite right. Anyway, point is that I'm guessing you weren't one of those people. Anyway, go on. You say, I maybe feel crappy about most of my interactions with you because the stake feels so high. I feel like you have been in my life forever, and the thought of you being irritated with me with no relationship that could actually repair the transgression is scary. Just chiming in here. Yeah, I totally get that. I can relate to it as well. There are podcasts that I have parasocial relationships with, and when I very occasionally will interact with them, the one time you manage to get an interaction with them, it's such high stakes. And so that would be very distressing. And I get that. I understand that. Going on with your email. I sent in questions for you and Umberto for the 14-year reunion and immediately regretted asking the two questions that I know you and him purposely never answer. So just chiming in here, I'm guessing, well, I won't speculate as to what those questions are, but I can imagine what those questions were. I felt immediately annoyed at myself for being so nosy, pushy, and invasive when what I really wanted to do was be cheeky and indicate that I listen enough to know your inside jokes. So just chiming in here. I'm guessing that I got that, although I don't remember because we received hundreds of submissions to the 14th anniversary reunion survey thing. But yeah, I'm guessing that I did experience it as cheeky and as an indication that you get it, right? Going on here. What I was trying to say was, I love you and I thank you, but I understand that my question accomplished something very different. It was disrespectful and annoying. I am working hard not to be so reactive and impulsive as I have been. End of email. Well, did I read those questions and get annoyed on the air? Just because if I did, that's annoying of me to do. But yeah, I wish that we could know each other better. And so that you would feel like, well, I always think about this one moment where I have this long-term friend, and we had this I don't know, this would have been 20 years ago or something, and we had this negative interaction. I can't remember what it was about, but it was some sort of conflict. And it wasn't horrible, but it was, it was notable. And the next time I saw her, I said, hey, I just want to apologize for what happened last time. And also I just want to check in and make sure that you're still good with me, or that we're still friends. We're still really good friends. And she immediately said to me, Kirk, if that ruined our friendship, then what kind of fucking friendship do we have? And I was like, yeah, if those little things that are normal in relationships destroy a relationship, then you didn't really have a relationship to begin with. And so I wish that you and I had that relationship where you would know that even if I did interpret it wrong and I was annoyed, that it wouldn't destroy what we have, right? It's hard to facilitate given that you're God knows where and I'm in Seattle in my house, right? But I wish that we had that. I'll say that. But I accept your apology fully. And please do not beat yourself up about it. There are things that I wish people would mildly beat themselves up about, not terribly, but, there were things during the trial, for example, where I was being treated in a way that I wish those people would look at themselves in the mirror a little bit. But you're not one of those people, given what you're telling me that you did. We'll say they were transgressions of a sort, but they were minor and not, and perhaps worthy of apology and worthy of me forgiving and accepting your apology, but not worthy of you looking yourself in the mirror. All right, final email. This will end the Apology Deep Dive series. It's been a journey, people. Last email. Anonymous patron, she says, whilst listening to the deep dive on apology, I couldn't stop thinking about an apology experience I had. And on reflection, I think it's one of the best emotional learning experiences I've ever had. Maybe a good example of the power of forgiveness. My first boyfriend broke up with me quite suddenly. It turned out that he had lied to me about a lot of things in our relationship, and I was absolutely devastated. Several months later, he tried to apologize to me and essentially wanted to get back together, and I was absolutely brutal towards him. I felt completely righteous in making fun of these attempts to his face and behind his back. I cut off all contact with him. About 4 years later, I was at work, and my mind was wandering when I started to reflect on that relationship. This was probably the first time I'd thought about him in months, if not years, and something happened. What I can only describe as a wave of forgiveness washed over me. I have never experienced anything like this before or since. It was such an intense emotion and seemingly came from nowhere. Just chiming in here, yeah, I think I know what that feels like, anonymous patron. That feeling of, my head is in Inside Out, the movie. It feels like it would be one of those very nuanced memories that is bubbling up. A feeling of anger and sadness and pain and joy and reminiscing and nostalgia and longing and all those things happening at once, right? Meaning, the passage of time, the familiarity of the person, all that stuff bubbling up. And then also a final, another way to frame it, or a way I might frame it if I, hearing your story, is that in the background of your emotional processing, you had been processing that experience to some extent. You might have been thinking about it occasionally, kind of, or even symbolically. You might have had dreams about it. You might have watched a TV show or a movie and started to cry and didn't know it, but you were actually grieving or thinking about this relationship and its passing. And so you weren't consciously processing what you went through with him and his apology, but you were in the background and maybe symbolically processing it. It's something that I don't often talk about, but I think it's incredibly important to recognize that we do this. And particularly for you therapists out there that work with kids and teens, particularly you therapists that work with kids, and also parents of kids and teachers as well. But when children, so let me give an example from my work that I would find, and I discovered this. I don't think anyone really taught me this. I think the kids actually taught me this. Was, you'd have a kid whose dad died, and say she's 8 years old, and the parents are concerned about her, so they bring her into therapy. And my job is to get her to grieve, or to get her over the fact that her father's died, or something like that. Whatever they tell me to do, that's what we start with. And then I might at first ask her directly, tell me about your dad, or tell me about your family, or how do you feel about your dad dying? And I might not get any answers. I might get a lot of I don't knows, or a lot of denials, or avoidance, or annoyance that I'm asking those questions, which was the vast majority of the time. That's the way kids were. And so I would have to figure something else out. And what I would do is to work symbolically. You can do this through art or play or sand tray or there's even just talking about things that are metaphorical. For example, let's say that the 8-year-old can talk about Star Wars. The 8-year-old loves Star Wars. And so I might say, let's draw Star Wars characters. Okay. And so we're drawing Star Wars characters and we're having fun. And we draw Luke Skywalker, and we draw Han Solo and Princess Leia. And I say, what do you think of Luke Skywalker? Luke is da-da-da. And I say, well, what do you think about Darth Vader being Luke's father? And, Darth Vader, he was a bad guy, but then Luke got him to be a good guy. Oh, okay. So, and you remember that scene when when Luke takes off Darth Vader's helmet and reveals Anakin, and he looks vulnerable and small on the inside, and then he dies. And, how did you feel during that moment? Okay, this is a pretty ham-fisted way of describing it, but, that wouldn't be unusual, that type of session, that type of moment in a session. And the 8-year-old, let's say that I engineer it well enough, I sneak in through the back door well enough that the 8-year-old doesn't consciously recognize or doesn't care that it's connected to her own father dying, and starts to talk about it, might even have some emotion about it or something. So in that moment, we're talking about Darth Vader and Luke, but in reality, or at least partially, we're also, I imagine as a therapist, we're also talking about her own father passing. Okay, so we also do that as adults throughout our life when we're watching a movie. When I'm watching Inside Out and I'm bawling and I'm sobbing and and I knew this in the moment as well. I did think about this, that there's something else is going on with me right now. Some other sadness that, maybe a dozen sadnesses that I could identify that I was processing in that moment as I'm watching Riley experience alienation and loneliness and rejection and anger and sadness and confusion. I am consciously registering a cartoon made by Pixar, but unconsciously or semi-consciously, I am mapping onto this cartoon my own deep emotional needs. And so there's a possibility, I don't know, that for you, anonymous patron, you were processing that loss of this first boyfriend. You were processing the anger and the hurt and the apology and how you purposely set out to humiliate him. And all of that was, every time you watched a movie or a reality TV show, for example, there were things that you were consciously reacting to, but unconsciously you were processing. I don't know, just possibility. And then you say you have this massive, intense emotional experience as this wave, as you say, of forgiveness washes over you, going on with your email. After listening to your podcast, I would frame it now that I had been subconscious. Oh, I should have gone on with your email. Oh, joy. After listening, and by the way, behind me on my bookshelf, I have all these. During the pandemic, I was bored so often that often I would just go online and buy little nerdy things. And of all the hundreds of little nerdy things that I bought, two of them were figures for joy and sadness. So they are behind me. So let's see. After listening to your podcast, I would frame it now that I had been subconsciously doing the work of forgiveness by growing up, getting more life experience, having different relationships, and becoming more self-aware. All of these things fell into place in that one moment, and I could see the relationship at enough distance to reflect on my own part in its breakdown. This wave of forgiveness was immediately followed up by guilt for the way in which I'd treated him afterwards. I felt strongly that I needed to let him know I was sorry. I sent him a message apologizing for the way I'd treated him. He was incredibly surprised to hear from me, but immediately accepted my apology and apologized for his actions. We both agreed that we had been too young for the intensity of our relationship, and that overall we had a lot of fun together. It was a very short message exchange, but it meant so much to both of us. We had a lovely chat and would occasionally message each other for several years after. This interaction had a monumental impact on the way I live my life and how I see relationships, arguments, and apologies. Whereas I used to think back on that relationship and feel pain and hurt, now all I feel is nostalgia for first love. This did so much to heal my negative relationship schemas and help me enter new relationships with an open heart. End of email. Yeah, that's beautiful. You're talking about because you could have avoided it, right? You had this wave of forgiveness that overcame you. You could have easily just been like, anyway, back to whatever I was doing. You might. It sounds like you had an impulse to reach out to him, and you could have not, right? You could have avoided that. I'm guessing if you would have asked people around you, I don't know the kind of friends you have, but I think the average person would say, don't contact him. That's just going to be confusing. It was many years ago. It's just, open old wounds, or it'll be a can of worms, or he'll misinterpret it, or if he's married, it'll screw things up, or whatever. But you didn't, Now, I'm not saying you're always supposed to reach out, but you did. You did reach out. You intuited that it would go well, and it did go well, and it provided this very needed corrective experience. You could have easily just moved past that without paying attention to your needs, and your schema would have been a little bit changed, but not as much as it had been, right? Now you have a very different story, very different narrative of what happened because of what you did. The same things happened back then, anonymous patron. He, as you put it earlier in the email, he broke up with you suddenly, and it turned out that he had lied to you about a lot of things in your relationship and that you were devastated. Cheating was involved, maybe? I don't know. So that happened. Those are facts. But the way you narrativize it is a choice to some extent. That we have not a choice, but if we fully listen to our needs and act on them, then often a very nuanced, yin-yang, balanced narrative will emerge that is more helpful to us. Again, going back to Inside Out, that's exactly what happens by the end of the story, is that she is going through something very difficult, and she sees it very black and white. She sees Minnesota as all good, and she sees the new San Francisco as all bad. And she just wants to go back to Minnesota, but through the process, joy and sadness can work together and understand each other and value each other. And in that process, you can have memories that involve both joy and sadness, and they can sit together in peace and harmony at the same time. It doesn't mean that there isn't suffering. It just means that you acknowledge that suffering and that you're with it and that you meet it and that you express it and that you get care around that, both internally and from the outside. And so you did that for yourself. You leaned into it and you reached out to him. You said, hey, I don't know what you said, but it probably was, you treated me pretty badly, and there was that, but then I treated you really badly, and I feel bad. And then you apologized, and I never really acknowledged your apology, and I was mean to you. But I feel bad about that, but I also want to tell you that I forgive you. I accept your apology after all these years. And now, as you say, you have a different schema about that affects everything, right? You say that you healed your negative relationship schema and it helped you to enter new relationships with an open heart. Your working model of self and other has been changed by you noticing the wave of forgiveness and acting on it, right? Emotions are action things. We tend to frame emotions as, tinglings in our bones and in our heart that happen. But a more helpful way to think about emotion is that emotions are indication of needs that require action. In between your need and action is emotion. Someone is stepping on your foot, and that's a need that is happening. You're your foot harmed. You need to pull your foot away from that person stepping on your foot. And so you're trying to get to an outcome where you pull your foot out from underneath their foot, but there's an emotion in between there, which is pain, an experience of pain or anger of injustice or something. The emotion is what sits in between. It tells you what's going on and motivates you to meet your needs. And you had this wave of forgiveness. And I'm guessing it was quite complicated as an emotion, right? A longing, a sadness, a joy, an anger, a grief, or whatever. Those emotions motivated you to do a lot of things, to think, to cry maybe, to reach out, to process, to talk about it, to email to me. This wave of forgiveness that you listen to has created so many behaviors that I'm guessing, based on what you're saying, met your needs. And you also met his needs. And you met mine because you gave me something to talk about on this podcast. And that does it for the Apology Deep Dive series. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself. Get those apologies from others that you deserve and give those apologies. And forgive those people who deserve to be forgiven and get those forgivenesses that you deserve to be given because you deserve it. You really, really do.